Thank you very much for your attendance. I think you know how these sessions work. I think our job is to make unusual productions available to the student and the faculty community at SCI-Arc. I think we've done that. And then to discuss the content, the meaning, the exegesis, all of that, and to see what they got right and what they might have missed and what they conceivably will include the next time around. All in the spirit of a kind of critical intellectual discussion. And I probably should say that and I think many of you know, that the kind of work that Bryan does and what you're looking at on the wall, there should be, do you have a rapidograph?
Several, yeah.
Yeah? How many people know what a rapidograph is?
4.
Yeah? No, it's okay to raise your hand. Longevity is not a crime. Maybe it is. So So I think the point is that I think we have to talk about this a little, whether the work represents an anachronism, whether it represents a capacity which is unique to an individual but is not transferable in terms of the tools and in terms of the content, or whether there's an associational meaning that you can use and you can exploit and extend based on what's on the wall here. So I think the first point should be that the density of the work and the commitment to the work and what clearly is an act of love in the process of delivering what we have on the walls today is without saying, therefore I say it, very much admired and very much appreciated in a context that very much admires and appreciates those kinds of efforts. One of the problems I mentioned to Bryan, you know, when you walk into the Louvre, and we're not in the Louvre, but you walk into the Louvre and there's Da Vinci and there's Caravaggio and there's Michelangelo and there's the Winged Victory of something or other. And you always feel like, you don't always feel, I always feel like it would be great if they would move everything out for a minute and just look at the Mona Lisa. In a way, when you make an exhibition in a gallery, so there are lots of things up, we can't cover all of these items, nor can we make the kinds of distinctions that conceivably could be made if we walked around the room and looked at each item and tried to understand what it was. What I did was, and I suggest this to you, I read the text, so there's a text out next to 3 wine bottles. So leave the wine bottles and read the text, and it gives you some idea about the aspirations of the project, which I think is where we get into some difficulty, let's say. So I'm going to make some references, and Bryan and I will kick some of this around, but I'll make some references to the text as I read it in the brief that I'm recommending to you. I think one of the first claims is that the work is the work of a visionary, that these are visionary projects, okay? So we know from sojourns through this school by Pete Cook, by Lebbeus Woods, and other people, Eric Mendelsohn making sketches in the trenches of Verdun, or Cedric Price, who I think was a colleague at a certain point or a teacher of Pete Cook. what it means to be a visionary. So the first question is, if this is visionary work, what is the vision? What is the prognosis? What does it mean in this context to represent this as visionary work?
I think it's blurred vision. That's an interesting question. The context of attempting to peel back the layers of what I've been working on over the last 5 or 10 years, but exclusively maybe the last 6 months for most of the work in this situation, is trying to maybe portray not so much that it is visionary work, but that there is a vision of, as we talked about before, an imperfection of the hand, an imperfection of the building process, of the printing process, of the construction process, and maybe how to layer the recognition of those imperfections.
But wait. I mean, before we get into the technique of the drawing, I'm asking you something a little bit different. So maybe you can answer this, and maybe you're not comfortable answering it. But what I'm saying is there's a tradition of drawing, and the tradition of drawing has to do with prognosis or prediction, visionary, meaning someone who would envision, let's say, a different world. So Sir Thomas More did that, Utopia, or Plato did that. They're visionaries. You can discourse about what they envisioned. And what I'm saying is that the text represents the work as visionary, meaning it's a prognosis. It's a forecasting. So what I'm asking is, what is it forecasting? Is it looking to a future? If it's looking to a future, what contents is it aspiring to? So what is it telling us about our lives in the future? Leb, Cedric Price, Pete Cook, so on and so on. Is it visionary in that way?
Okay, I don't know if I would consider it visionary in that way. I think it talks about maybe a condition of architectures that are created with maybe the creation of future technologies to sort of augment some of the devices that are created, but I don't really see these things as conditions of the future, especially on the sort of the project side. I think they're conditions of looking at the conditions of now that might be using maybe technologies that are not.
Maybe you could explain that just as a parenthesis. What represents drawing? What represents building? What represents project? So there's subdivisions of the room.
Sure. Yeah. So dirty geometries, mechanical imperfections. The idea is that the gallery is kind of split in half. The sort of analog hand explorations without trying to define a specific object or set of objects or conditions would be on this side of the room. Some more of theoretical architectural projects that may not have a specific site or program as an external source on this side, and then the sort of the divisionary membrane that actually is kind of a transition between the theoretical projects and the drawings, or the two projects on this side that are actually proposals for real projects, but that are both, interestingly enough, sign conditions dealing with a graphic set of information that's portrayed out of architecture. So it's kind of, it's literally segmented.
Okay, so can we hop back to that visionary discussion? Or are we done with that discussion?
I don't see these as visionary in terms of projecting a future.
Okay. It does, I mean, I think I said this, it mentions that. Let me ask you another one. It just occurred to me. Do you consider yourself a modern architect? Are you a modern architect?
To be honest, I'm not really sure I consider myself an architect. So modern is not really the descriptor that I would pay attention to in that one. I think it's looking at conditions of architecture as the conditions of making and the conditions of representation filtering into the manifestation of the event that you see on the wall. So I don't know if that's a modern philosophy or a modern statement or not.
I mean, it's clear you're very interested in the production of the drawings and the technique
Right.
of the drawings, and so we're going to get to that. But a lot of the text talks about other kinds. The reason I asked that, it just occurred to me, is I wonder, John will appreciate this, was one of the texts that always fascinated me was Don Quixote, and Don Quixote in Cervantes is always represented as a kind of running out of gas of chivalry. So chivalry represents a certain way of medieval life, let's say. That's what it is. And all of a sudden, here comes somebody around who's bumbling and stumbling and can't get it right and fights the windmills and burns the books and does all of that. And I'll tell you what the analogy is. It occurred to me that you have to watch this, that not in a personal way, not in a committal way, that this represents modern architecture getting tired of itself and getting skeptical of itself and being pessimistic about itself. Because modern architecture, in an idealized sense, has, I think, a capacity for wonder and prowess. Look what we can do. So technology and the image of technology gives us the capacity to remake the world, which is why the constructivists and others for many years running around talking about the new man. It's a new man. But now, all of a sudden, even though the imagery is recognizable, the discourse that surrounds the imagery is not perfect, and prowess and capacity, it's very different. It's dirty and it's imperfect, which seems to me to be a critique of the fundamental aspiration of modern architecture, at least if you understand modern architecture as a style or a form language, that this is coming after that form language. Although strangely enough, it doesn't really seem to produce an alternative form language, but it produces an alternative discourse. So instead of looking at how high can we build, how high can we fly, can we make a bridge across the Bering Strait, you know, all of those kinds of things. We're going to talk about a couple of projects like that. It seems to be backing off that, and it seems to be expressing a very fundamental skepticism about the prowess of all things, the machine. And the machine is science, and the machine is utility. I think the machine is a way to objectify human affairs. I mean, look, if we can build a city on Mars, we'll do it, right? If we can control the weather and get up there, we're going to do it, right? Or is this, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't do it? So you're backing off, you're getting tired. Not physiologically, but intellectually tired of the argument.
I think it's definitely backing off the idea that the machines or the mechanisms, the language of those have to be a perfect and an ordered system. I think it's more of a commentary that the devices that we assume to have a perfection of making, a perfection of function, possibly taking us past the possibilities that we can achieve as humans, has to be there and has to be that rigid. It's trying to look at, hopefully, more of a poetic example of what the machines can be, of what technology can be. Specifically, the ones over here, they're dealing with the sort of ideas about the imperfections of how social media is sort of causing a new layer, a new method of communication or lack of communication or dependency on communication, which looks at possibly the imperfect qualities of the internet and the computer as a device.
Yeah, but wait,
for
I mean,
that.
do the drawings communicate that, or is that something that you feel or you're concerned about? In other words, how does the exhibit carry those ideas? It's not so much those ideas, yes or no,
Right.
but when you look at the drawings, you look at the projects, you look at the buildings, those projects and buildings seem to have something, not the discourse, have this same kind of machine energy optimism in them, but the description of them is that they're flawed, or
Right.
they're limited, or we should be skeptical. But if you look at a drawing, it doesn't look like the drawing of a skeptic. It looks like the drawing of an optimist. So this is called schizophrenia.
Right. Agreed.
No, you don't have to agree.
You know, when I was in grad school in UCLA in the 90s, there was an architect who did an exhibit. I believe the title was called Schizophrenia as the Cure, Not the Disease, which affected me greatly. I don't know if we remember who that was particularly, but I would agree. It is the vision of a schizophrenic. It's very interesting because I'm often labeled as kind of the experimental drawing guy, and I'm labeled as kind of the odd machine guy. And
we don't have to worry about what they label you, because now you have a chance to correct.
Right. I think it's actually it's kind of this bifurcation of the ideas. I don't necessarily see, and what I hope people don't take away is that the information that occurs over here through the experimental drawings are generating this work or are generating from this work. This is a completely different set of ideas that purposely does not have resolution. They're searching, and that this has resolution not in the sense that it's finite, but that it comes to some formal conclusion that as architects we can understand walls and floors and site and scale, where these are either devoid of them or they're so saturated with them that it's impossible to determine where those separations happen.
Why don't you guys come in? They printed it backwards by mistake, but you can. Why don't you guys come in, and then you can listen to all this. It's fascinating. One point having to do with the exhibition, Bryan was making a reference to an exhibit we did a long time ago called Schizophrenia Was a Cure, Not a Disease. And I just remember it because I got a letter, a very nasty letter from a clinical psychiatrist whose son was a schizophrenic. I never forgot it. I saved the letter, and he said, "Why the hell are you screwing around with games with schizophrenia? It's a serious disease," and so on and so on. So I didn't do it anymore. I tried to find something else, but the point of that argument was a little bit different than this point. I think what I was saying is that the argument you're making is not the argument the drawings are making. The argument that I was making is that it's important to hold contradictory ideas in the work simultaneously. But that's in the work, not just in the discussion, whether you did it or I did it. So but that was the point. Right. So it's a little bit different point in this case. Let me ask you something else. I thought of this when we were talking a few minutes ago. Stanford has a new library, Stanford University, on the campus, except it's an old remodeled building with very sophisticated robotics. And have you seen that one with a robot copying? And the robots are are copying books and breaking copyright laws and doing all of these things that only Stanford University is allowed to do. So this is the most sophisticated, at this moment, technical capacity for delivering information of all kinds in various ways to all of these very intelligent students and faculty members. But what's interesting about it is the building looks like it was done by H.H. Richardson. And this is the point, that the architecture of the building is very Stanfordish. Have you been on the campus at Stanford? So, tiles and bricks and rusticated stuff, all of that. But the split personality again, the split between the content, the technical content of the library, and the capacity of the library to deliver sophisticated information, and the image of the library, H.H. Richardson, super old-fashioned. So there's a fundamental question, which is if the intellectual content has to do with the image of technology, or whether you can separate the operation of technology in the most sophisticated way from the image of it, which disappears entirely. So you walk in that library, it really is H.H. Richardson with all the rusticated stuff and the big puffy chairs and so on, and furniture that it looks like antique stuff. But it's a fascinating juxtaposition that the image of what is new is not necessarily the same as what's new.
Right.
So, I mean, the question here is if the intellectual content has to do with a capacity to deliver information in a library, should the image of the library correlate with the technical capacity of the library so they coincide? So what you're doing, because they're doing it, the robots in there flipping pages.
Right.
You go in the room, it looks like a 19th century room,
Yeah.
So did they miss something, or did we miss something?
I think if you use these drawings as a filter for that, I would say that they missed something. My thesis for these would be that any and actually, I guess for these projects as well, is that architectures or spaces or environments that are dealing with an inherent thick technology of production or whatever that they're doing, that should not be suppressed through other architectural or ornamental, if you will, means, that it should become the thing itself. That I wouldn't see a division between the technical insides that are doing the work and the external components that are trying to fit within a context of a campus. So I would think that they would. I'm not familiar with the building you're talking about. I would say that I would think that they would have to.
Nobody is.
Yeah, that's part of the problem.
Well, but what I'm trying to do is, because it works in an operational sense,
right.
It serves its community in a functional sense, however prosaic you think that is. But the image of progress or capacity or information system is supplanted by kind of generic Stanford campus fit in with all of that crap.
Right.
And they do it that way, which tells you it's possible to have that kind of sophisticated capacity and not to read it in the physiognomy of the building. And I think what we're looking at here is a kind of consistency that relates to how you make it and what the image is in terms of a more sophisticated technology, a production technology, and the image of that process, regardless of what it's delivering. So there's kind of homogeneity of imagery regardless of capacity. I mean, for instance, you could have made that library the other way, and it could have looked like this, an act of conviction, and then put very conventional stacks into the library, Let me ask you one something about, and I bumped into this, and I don't know it very well, but you can help us with this. This sounds like a drink at Starbucks, but it's not, or maybe it is. Wabi-sabi. Do you know wabi-sabi? Huh?
I think it's a sushi dish.
No, don't spoil it. Wabi-sabi. Anybody? All the people who know what a rapidograph is must know what wabi-sabi is. No? Nobody. So. Yeah, this is a kind of associationally, and I think, again, this is where we run into a little bit of difficulty, that there are all sorts of genuine attempts to locate this work with respect to particular kinds of ideas that are not normatively architectural ideas. Wabi-sabi, I think, is Japanese. It's Japanese, it's Buddhist, although it's Japanese Buddhist. Buddhism doesn't originate in, I think it originates in India or something. But anyway, it's Japanese Buddhist, and I think it has to do with a conception of beauty and imperfection. But imperfection, Bryan and I talked about, is backwards. And it's backwards because everything is imperfection. So it's not like you make something which is perfect and then you kick it. And now it's wabi-sabi, because guess what? It has a dent in it. Or you make a cup and then you push your finger in it and you fire it and it has a kink in it. I think the meaning is, guess what? Everything has a kink in it. That's the point. That there is no perfection that this is anomalous to. The anomaly is the perfection, not the opposite. So what's interesting about this, and maybe I got it wrong, is that somehow the machine as an ideal, or the law, or the science, either Copernicus, Kepler, Darwin, somebody making laws, rules, objectifying us and our lives. And I think Wabi-sabi would say that that's the anomaly. That is to say, the imperfection is the anomaly. The imperfection is the consistency. The perfection is the anomaly. And I think what we're looking at here, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that perfection is the machine, and the analysis, and the rule, and the system, and the method. That's perfection. And that once in a while you slip or you trip, and that's the imperfection. I don't think that's what wabi-sabi is. I think wabi-sabi is the opposite of that. Is that, you know what I mean?
Well,
in other words, wrong is right and right is wrong.
Right.
Everything is wrong, and every once in a while you get it right. And that's the exception, right?
Sure. And we would assume that any of these are in fact right, which they aren't, right? Wrong.
But they're almost right.
Right. My understanding of wabi-sabi was not so much that it's a dent that's introduced, but that through the process of making, when things are made, I think it's more about the perception of perfection, so that objects are made by man or by machines that are made by man that appear to be or have the perception of perfection, but there's the purposeful introduction of an imperfect element to recognize the human condition. That's my sort of reading of wabi-sabi. So I think it's tangential to what you're talking about, but it's slightly different. Although I do have to say, when we were walking around earlier, the notion that the imperfection, that it's reversed and that I've got it backwards, I think is incredibly fascinating. I've already started editing these drawings and planning the next series based on that notion, because there's something.
Don't listen to me, man.
No, I think there's something.
You got
that's really,
enough problems.
I think there's something that's really fascinating about the idea that the imperfect quality, which is thought of as the anomaly, is the basic condition, and that the perfection, which is inachievable in theory, becomes that sort of anomaly. So it's a very interesting filter through which I have started to look at the work, and I think through the condition of wabi-sabi and as a concept.
And I think we know that when you build something and you draw it,
right,
and what you draw is never what you build, and depending on how you draw it, notwithstanding Katia, Bentley et al., I mean, we run into situations where you build this piece and then you come and measure the next piece, because the first piece isn't quite so you never get to that stage. So that, whether that's an aspiration or not, that's why I said that I thought the tired modernism, meaning did we give up, actually? In other words, does this represent a kind of, notwithstanding its beauty, its love, its effort, its rapidograph, that it represents a kind of backing down at a point where, paradoxically, there are huge, huge projects. I mean, I was looking, and I made a couple of notes about this. You know, the Goddard Pass in the Swiss Alps, which is 57 kilometers drilled through God knows what. Colossal project, fantastic project. I mean, as a technical achievement in Switzerland. There's another one that they're talking about now in South Korea. I don't know the latest prognosis. There are two rivers in South Korea, you know, the Han and the Nakdong, very far apart, and they're going to connect the rivers. They're going to build what essentially is a canal that allows you to sail from Japan through Korea to China, for all those of you who wanted to take that trip. Now you can do it. But there's a huge opposition to that, a colossal opposition to that, which comes from the skepticism, should we do that project? And other things, I mean, for example, the Mississippi River. I can remember a few years ago, New York Times ran a huge article, double-page article. You know what we have to do with the Mississippi River and following Katrina and so on? We have to rebuild the Mississippi Delta. So, or should we touch it? And I think maybe what is being raised here is both a love of the capacity to draw and to draw to infinity, but an intellectual way to retreat somewhat from the expectation of the prowess that modern technology, in a utilitarian sense, can deliver. There's a skepticism of that. So don't remake the Mississippi, don't connect the Han and the Nakdong, don't drill through the mountain, or do. But it potentially raises that question that it would have to be discussed. But then you're raising environmental issues, sociological issues, economic issues, political issues, a lot of those discussions which need to take place, which don't take place so much in the work, which belongs to its own kind of insistent drawing language. I mean, if you look at, we'll talk a little bit about Lebbeus, for instance. If you look at the project he did for the Malecón in Havana, which, you know, the big flying Zambezi brothers, you know, the kinetic piece, fantastic drawing. But if you listen to the arguments are not about how the drawing was made or any of those kinds of issues, not entirely so, but largely so. But the political arguments, the social and political arguments that were made that surrounded that project and his argument for doing it, the necessity of doing it in a social and a political context. And I guess the question would be, is there a social and a political context to this discussion at all, really?
Not on this side. There should not be. That's not what the nature of the work is. On this side, hopefully, especially with the cosmology virus and the social amplifier projects, that's what drove them. But in terms of the drawings, that was never the protocol for why they were generated. They were one of the main sort of impetus for looking at these was looking at the let me put it this way. So when I was 16, working for interning for my first architect, when I was doing some drafting,
Guys come in here, huh?
went out to a site visit and had my mentor at the times giving me a critique about, we were having a discussion about the fact that we had a lead drawing of a straight line that represented a wall, and he sort of gave me the epiphany that there's no such thing as a straight wall, that's where the imperfection was. And I became very confused and somewhat obsessed about the information that was contained in the instructions for the construction methodology that was not transferred. So the drawings suggested a perfect nature. They suggested an order, a legal description, a physical description of how to make things. But the fact that those things were not actually made, as you said, nothing ever matches the drawings, and things have to be sort of adapted. So this part of the exhibition, the drawings, the explorative nature of the drawings, deal with not closed systems that I was trained when I was learning how to do construction documents by hand, old school, but more about looking at open systems and systems of confusion and systems of contrast that were not inherent in the way that we were describing the buildings. So that's not a, I don't think that's...
I mean, if you, I know Wolf did a house that he called the open house, and there are a lot of, doesn't mean everybody should come all the time, but it has to do with a capacity to include over time very different kinds of events. One way to understand that would be to see a variability in the linguistics of it. In other words, whether a project or a drawing, this is back to your point about schizophrenia as a cure, whether the drawing could admit its opposite, its antithesis. In other words, whether you could include in the drawing, for instance, and this may be very uncomfortable for you, it looks like it would be, a different kind of language, a clumsier language, because I think one could probably argue you're the master of this language. Are you? You know, when you start to draw, in a way, you could forecast the end when it begins. You know what's coming in a certain sense. Is that fair to say? And the question would be whether it would be possible in this context to start to make a drawing and you wouldn't know, or you would arrive at a place that you didn't recognize, and it wouldn't be anywhere near as dense or intense or beautiful in a particular kind of way, because the density and intensity has to do with a kind of line work linguistics, surfaces and lines. You say, okay, I know how to do that. And maybe there's more to that. There always is that possibility. In other words, that and more of it, which somehow transforms it into something else. I'm just looking again at the description of the building as open, because to me it looks more like your first phrase. It looks like a closed system, that it wouldn't, you know, when you do, like, you make a drawing and then your kid makes you make a line, a kid makes a line, and so you're admitting another personality to the discussion, you know, another way to see or to think or to feel. And I don't know whether that's the next step you take, maybe. Not so much collaborative, that you're collaborating with another piece of your personality that hasn't appeared yet. That the assuredness of the system or the method, the certainty of the method, as it expresses skepticism about mechanics, and it raises the question of flaws or shadows or ghosts or bends or cracks, all of those things. But when you look at it, it doesn't feel like something which is about to fall apart, because it conveys a kind of unmanageability. You know, the sort of visceral reaction of the drawing to the drawing, from my point of view, is completely different. Compelling as it is, you know, that it's pulling you more and more and more and more over here. You know, if you started in the middle of the room and pulling, you're never going to get to this corner. Right. You know, that the destination, just raising it as a...
You know, that's interesting. I don't necessarily view, especially the drawings, as being the thing that you were talking about in terms of closed. Maybe it's the language that I'm choosing to convey these images through. To me, they're still incredibly unfinished.
Rich.
They're half baked. They're not complete by any stretch.
I don't think you mean half baked.
I think they're not baked all the way, so maybe 3/4 baked, but yeah.
But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And half baked, like you know how to make the cake, and you only cook half.
I actually
but
do.
you still know how it's going to finish.
Correct, unless you pull it out and look at that as a new starting point. So I don't
Maybe
think
the half-baked cake is not a finished cake.
you're right. It's
Wolfgang Puck, maybe go
Right,
for
right.
that. Okay, Stephanie says I have to stop, so we stop. I just wanted to say again that how welcome Bryan and his work and his colleagues are at SCI-Arc, and that kind of love and which you can't pass to anybody else, I tell you the truth. It just comes out of working on drawings, and people who do that will look at this and will appreciate it in a way that has not anything to do with what we just talked about. So go and have some mojito out there. It's legit tonight. Thanks to Bryan, and take your time and read the text and have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.